Thank you, Joanna, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you talking about dyslexia and other related language-based learning disorders. Um, last year, I was doing a similar presentation and we got so far involved in the discussion of dyslexia, we did not get to some of the other related learning disorders. So what I've done now this year is I've flipped it, and so I'm going to start with dyscalculia, which really means challenges with math, and then go to dysgraphia, which has to do with writing and spelling and so on. Then we'll deal with dyslexia, which I'm sure we'll have time to do. But I want to make sure that we don't miss the parts on dyscalculia and dysgraphia, because really those are significant learning challenges for students, learning differences, and less is known about them than dyslexia. So with that in mind, we will move on. At the end of each section, I'll stop and ask for questions, and Joanna will read questions that come in on the chat, and I'll do my best to answer. So this is kind of a blurry image here, and I'm sorry for that, but what you see here is effectively what we see here is our language-based specific learning disorders, SLDs, which is a diagnostic category. Within that, you can see by the size of the bubble that dyslexia has probably the biggest impact on the most number of people. And within that are some sub disorders: sound processing, auditory processing, visual processing, and so on. And over here is dyscalculia, which is a specific learning disorder. It has some overlap with dyslexia, not a huge amount, but they do sometimes co-occur. And then we also have dysgraphia, which has to do with written language, with writing and spelling and so on, excuse me. And then over here is dyspraxia, which really is more of a motoric effect, which I'm not going to be covering tonight. But anyway, you see the relationship here. Dysgraphia and dyscalculia affect a smaller percentage of people than dyslexia does, but they tend to be somewhat related. So starting with dyscalculia, DYS, if you're not aware, is a word element that means difficulty. So dyscalculia means difficulty with calculation or math. And up here, if it's too small to see, here's a student saying to a teacher, "How do you know I have a learning disability? Maybe you have a teaching disability." And I find that particularly useful when talking about dyscalculia, because math instruction really under any circumstance, requires a very good teacher who has very good communication skills and can serve as a kind of a buffer between what math actually is and communicating that to students, because language sometimes gets in the way of learning math. So one question is, the first question that we want to deal with is exactly why. Why do students struggle with math? And there are actually different theories about that. Math there is not nearly as much research into math learning and or math difficulty as there is in reading. We know a lot about what it takes to be a good reader, what kind of instruction readers need, what challenges can impact readers, what to do about it, but not nearly as much with math. So some of the issues revolve around language. So being able to calculate and teaching students how to calculate depends a lot on language. And that means really clear language used by an instructor, but to some extent, it's also what your native language is, because English is, mathematical terms in English are not terribly brain friendly. They tend to, if anything, kind of obstruct or challenge memory and so on. So there is that. Then, being able to approximate, in other words, what do you how many beans are in this jar, or all those things where you guess how many marbles in a jar or Cheerios in a box or whatever. And that actually relies on the visual spatial networks of the left and right sides of the brain, the parietal lobes. And so so sometimes the visual, one's visual spatial ability, in other words, one's ability to perceive what things are like in 3 dimensions, or in space or visually, can be substantially different or be a little off, which makes approximation and therefore sense of mathematical mathematical tasks more difficult. So the ability to approximate also, to some extent, conflicts with what it takes to calculate and to solve math problems. And so, in order to approximate by, approximating, say, a space, approximating the number of things, any of that, as I said, depends a lot on visual spatial abilities, which is a cognitive ability. Yet calculation and solving mathematical problems have a lot to do with language. So sometimes one's visual spatial ability kind of fights with what it takes to be able to do calculations, solve problems, and so on. So, language, again, inserts itself as an issue here. And the other thing is that, quite honestly, calculation and higher level math, once you get beyond basic operations and so on, frankly, is very difficult. It's more difficult than many other cognitive processes, maybe even more difficult than reading, although I would argue they're comparable. However, it's there are reasons for that, but this also, there's a lot of room for struggle here if there are issues with any kind of visual spatial or with language. And moving on. So the number sense that we have, is actually genetic, and people show babies, people who have not been instructed in math at all, are able to have a sense of, like, there are more or less objects, and roughly how many there are, up to a certain small number. But exact calculation requires understanding the language of math, and that's really a cultural tool. So being able to understand the symbols of math, pluses, the minuses, the division signs, you know, is something that people have created, and over many thousands of years, but still. And then algorithms, solving algorithms also requires rules and what you do first and what you do next and so on. So calculation is basically accomplished by parts of the brain that have evolved for other purposes. And as we'll see, as is true with reading, our brains have a certain amount, are adaptable, and they have what's called plasticity, so that they can organize around tasks. But these are not necessarily, that's not necessarily tasks that we've evolved to do. We've evolved to speak. We haven't evolved necessarily to read, and we haven't evolved necessarily to do advanced calculation. So nature gives us their number sense, a sense of numbers, but culture provides numbers and number words, the numerals themselves. And so, as we'll see, there is some difference between cultures in terms of how efficient it is to do calculation and mathematical calculations and problem solving in some cultures than it is in others, and a lot of that is due to language. So human memory is also associative. So we like to think, we like to associate one thing with another. And that in math can cause some problems, because you know, these various associations that we have can interfere with each other. For example, there's the X in multiplication for times, the plus sign in addition. You get those mixed up and you come out with a very different answer. And actually, multiplication facts, which everyone thinks everyone should be able to know really easily, and life is easier if you don't. If you do remember your multiplication facts, but those facts have to be stored in a form that doesn't fit well with how human memory is organized. So it's easy to get them mixed up. It's easy to forget them, and it's easy to make errors with them. And adults with no particular learning disability diagnosis or anything else make errors in single-digit multiplication 10 to 25% of the time. So while we all say, let's, you know, we got to teach kids how to know their times tables, in fact, hanging on to those times tables can be difficult for many people, let alone a child who has some difficulty with memorizing and remembering and retrieving information and so on. So then we get to English and why things are, you know, are difficult, why math might be difficult, more difficult for English speakers, because English has special words for different decades of math. So there are special words for the numbers from 11 to 19. And then, you know, we go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then 11 and 12 and 13 and 14, 15, 16. Those are different, you know, so you have to adapt to that change. Then you go on to 20s and 30s and 40s. So all of that just makes a little bit of difference in terms of how quickly we can learn it and remember it and use that language to calculate. So, for example, you know, and now the other thing is that language we have to remember things in terms of the language of the numbers. So our language limits how many digits we can remember. You know, in those tests where somebody gives you, say, you know, gives you a string of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 digits and asks you to repeat them. Really, in English, the average person, like smack dab average person, 50th percentile, can remember on average 7 digits, which is why phone numbers used to have 7 digits, but of course they don't anymore. But now we don't have to remember anything because we all have cell phones and that dials it automatically. So I don't know what's going to happen to our memory there anyway. But in the Asian language, Chinese, Japanese, and so on, they have a different language. They have different words, much more efficient language for math words and so on. And they have different notation in many cases. The average person in China or Japan on the digit span can remember 10 digits rather than 7. So, and that's not because they're smarter necessarily, it just means that their language is easier and the numbers are easier to remember. So we have a kind of an innate kind of challenge just with our language in terms of learning math. So again, the other thing is that, you know, simple arithmetic depends on being able to speedily and efficiently retrieve answers from long-term memory, you know. So, you know, somewhere you think, you look at a 7 and a 6 and you add them and you think 13, you know, and so on. But so in order to solve problems, you know, very efficiently, in other words, to do mental math in your head, you've got to be able to temporarily store numbers so that you can solve a problem. If you don't know your facts, or if you don't retrieve them from memory very quickly, then it's going to be more difficult to calculate and solve problems, which leads to people doing things like counting on their fingers or having to use manipulatives and things of that nature. So that gets in the way. And some of that has to do with working memory. Now, working memory is a vital cognitive ability for learning, because working memory really is our problem-solving vehicle, one of them anyway, but a prominent one. Working memory does 4 things. First of all, it operates, it's very quick. It operates over a few seconds. It serves as a temporary storage place. So let's say you have to solve a problem, you know, like you have a rate distance, you know, one of those problems that I always used to hate, where, you know, 2 trains leave a station at a certain time, and, you know, one's traveling at this many miles per hour and the other one's at this, you know, and where will they meet? How long will it take them to meet? And then you have to figure that out. And that basically depends on you know, on your what your problem solving strategy is. So you've got to remember the rate, you know, that they're traveling, the speed at which they're traveling, the rate, the distance, and you've got to remember all those while you then pull out, if you're lucky to remember, the rate, distance, time formula, which allows you to manipulate the information. Now, and the other thing is that working memory allows you to focus your attention on this task. So if your working memory is compromised in any way, it's going to be difficult to hang on to those numbers. It may be difficult to pull up that formula, or, you know, you've got to figure out some strategy that might take more time than if you can remember the formula. And if your attention is, if you're easily distracted, then it's going to be very difficult to solve this problem. So any number of these things can interfere with math calculation. Now we have ways of accommodating that by teaching strategies, teaching students to do things one at a time, and so on, to make up for some of the difficulty that they might have with working memory. But it basically does have an impact on can have an impact on how well, how accurate, how fast a person can solve math problems. And so the memory issue, working memory is one. Sometimes there's a lot of difficulty with math fact retrieval, and that sometimes just has to do with, again, remembering the names of things, you know. And so we try strategies, we try mnemonics, we try other visualization to pair math facts with something that that students can remember to help them, you know, have a memory hook. Then there's procedural memory, which can get in the way if it's not if you're tired or if it just doesn't work very well. Carrying out multi-step procedures can become very challenging because you have to know first, and I mean long division is a great example of this, because for kids trying to learn, it's the hardest thing to teach and the hardest thing for elementary students to master, because you've got to do it involves several different steps depending on how big the numbers are. So if the procedural memory isn't, you know, it causes problems with sequencing or carrying out procedures, that's going to affect how well a student understands concepts, because they're so wrapped up in what are the steps they have to do to get the answer. The concept that lies beneath the whole thing can be really challenging. Then there are visual spatial deficits, which means, you know, lots and lots of kids, and I suspect adults too, have difficulty aligning numbers. And so oftentimes when that's the case, we have students use things like graph paper and things like that so they can put the numbers easily in columns. But even if you understand place value, if you don't put your numbers in the right column, you're going to have some difficulty, and that's going to lead to errors. And it's also going to lead to misinterpretation of place value. Visual spatial deficits will cause great difficulty in learning geometry, because that really requires an ability to think and calculate and see things in not just 2 dimensions, but 3 dimensions and so on. So what this all basically leads up to is that there are any number of challenges that may occur when students are learning math. And it's helpful to figure out, you know, what those are, and a good psychoeducational or neuropsych evaluation can help uncover some of those, because we can do accommodations, but these are some of the things that will interfere with learning math. So remediating math difficulties can take any number of directions, and so you kind of have to know where the challenge comes from. Is it language? Is it memory? Is it visual spatial perception? And depending on that, then you can choose an intervention that may be helpful. So here's an example of a visual spatial processing disorder. Imagine, if you don't see things clearly in columns, and and you're not totally sure. I mean, the whole borrowing thing, and the signs for telling you what to do, and this might be a multiplication sign and so on. it can, it can be really challenging to see what it is you're supposed to do. And, solving a problem here with how many cups there are, how do we do that? Do we approximate? You know, do we group them in weird groups? It causes a lot of delays if you have to stop and figure out what sort of strategy you are going to use. And in some cases, if you can't remember what strategies you've been taught, you may very well recede to more less advanced strategies that are going to take more time and slow you down, and that just interferes with the problem solution. So we we look to all of that. So if there, sometimes the memory problems may reflect issues with executive function. People with executive function can have difficulty with math, even though they may well understand concepts, because they're potentially don't have the capacity for processing information because their working memory is compromised in some way, or they're having a hard time just, understanding the number of words and processing those in a way that will help them solve problems. Any of these things, or a combination of things, can cause difficulty with math. And I think, I'll go back here because I'm about ready to take questions here. And I think that that we are learning more. I know in our school, one of the things we work very hard at doing is in math is, for one thing, really teaching concepts and place value very carefully, because if you, in order to advance a student from, more elementary math to higher level math that's required in secondary and school and beyond, if they go there, in order to do algebra and so on, you actually have to have a good foundation in place value. So at this point, I would be happy to take any questions that might have come up before we go on to talking about dysgraphia.
Well, so far there are no questions.
Wow.
People are ruminating.
Yes, exactly. Well, if you come up with a question, you may see some similarities in some of the causes or challenges that exist in these different diagnostic categories. And don't feel like you can't ask a question about math as we move on to the next topic. Okay, well, then I'll move on now and let's talk about dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is not a really well understood diagnosis, because people have there's the dys, which means difficulty, and graph, which means letters. So difficulty with letters. Well, is that handwriting? Well, actually, it's a lot more than messy handwriting. And there are people who have dysgraphia whose handwriting is actually pretty easy to read. So let's explore a bit into what dysgraphia actually is. So students with language-based challenges in writing, and I say language-based because writing is, again, one of those really difficult tasks that that people do that, again, we did not evolve to really do, but our very large brains and our brain's ability to adapt to tasks that we are asking it to do means that we can do this. So sometimes writing is not always a language-based issue. Sometimes it is an executive function issue, so that organization and translating thoughts to from concepts in the head to out your hands in either writing or typing or word processing is difficult on its own. But we're talking about really some of the language-based challenges. So students who have, or kids who have these issues, things you'll notice is that they have trouble following directions many times. They have to, they glance over them and maybe don't interpret them possibly very well. The other thing is that they may have difficulty organizing their thoughts as they speak and or in writing. Some people speak so clearly and their oral language is brilliant, and they can't somehow get those brilliant thoughts down on paper or on a computer screen or whatever. Oftentimes, a student or a child or a person with dysgraphia is slow. They need extra time to read, to write, extra time to word process, and so on. And when they do produce written work, it's often not very well explained. The content is sparse. There probably isn't a lot of detail. And there are a lot of grammar and spelling errors. And probably most important is that this person's writing doesn't really reflect how well they think, and teachers see this all the time. They have students who are contributing to class. They're offering reflections that are really high level and thoughtful, and then they just can't seem to get those things written down in any form. So that is something that you will see with students. They're kind of symptoms, you could say. So a child with dysgraphia may have trouble forming letters, forming numbers, forming words initially, spelling words correctly, and organizing thoughts and ideas. So, and some of that may be due to executive function, but on the other hand, if your attention is totally taken up with how do I form a B or a D, and what does the 7 look and the 9 look like? Is this right or is that right? And if you have to spend all your time thinking of, okay, what are the sounds in the words and what are the letters, that can really impede your ability to sort of think for higher order tasks such as planning and organizing that you need to do for effective written expression. You often will see dysgraphia co-occurring with dyslexia, but not always. Oftentimes with dyslexia, you're going to see poor spelling. It kind of they go together. But often there are times when someone reads pretty well, but their writing, their spelling is, their written expression is well behind their ability to read and think, etc. So sometimes you'll see, again, when, I often see students, even older students, who have really strange grips on the pencil. They often hold the pencil between their pointer finger and middle finger instead of, balancing it between their thumb and finger. And oftentimes this leads then to getting really tired from writing because because they've got this really tight death grip on the pencil, and that is just really tiring. Writing and even teaching word processing can be a great help, but unless it's really automatic, that takes a lot of time too, and the more time it takes to produce words, letters and words, the less time there is for thinking about what you actually want to say. Writing handwriting is illegible. The numbers and letters are poorly formed. Oftentimes they're not closed off. I've seen this dysgraphic writing that is honestly unreadable, inconsistent, slow, and eventually, students will just, the kids will just try to avoid writing at all costs. I mean, they'd rather be sent to timeout or to the principal's office or to in-school suspension, anything other than writing. And that is just a shame. So we have, again, a lot of these issues with spelling and grammar rules, tasks that require thinking while you're writing, aligning columns. All of these things are symptoms of dysgraphia. And here's some examples. You can see here, if you can read this, the letters are poorly formed. You can read it, but you're going to see there's crossouts and there's inconsistent pressure on the pencil. And, and here the lines are helpful, but not that much. And here's actually, cursive writing, which probably helps a little, but it isn't enough somehow. So, which brings me to handwriting instruction, because one of the things that schools have a lot of schools have given up on, but not us at Groves, I'll tell you, is that they've kind of given up really teaching handwriting. And I think some of this is due to schools, teachers, curriculum directors, whatever, thinking, well, who really needs to do handwriting anymore because they can type, they can also, speak. There's just why waste instructional time on it? But actually, keyboarding, as much as we want kids to be computer savvy and to be automatic with their use of technology, keyboarding itself really doesn't help students with writing tasks until they get to about 6th grade. It's important to start teaching them keyboarding so they get to know the keyboard, but it'll slow them down certainly for the first 6 years or so of schooling. The other issue is that high stakes tests like SATs, ACTs, and so on, that require writing tests, they won't allow students to use laptops and keyboarding. Things have to be written by hand, which seems archaic in this day and age, but that's the way it is, and unless it changes, perhaps. But, and then the other thing, and this is really a key thing, note-taking is much more effective when you take notes by hand. So, there have been good studies that with college students, high school students, and so on, who are sitting in lectures and so on, and they are taking notes, and some of them are doing it by hand, writing. Some of them are doing it on their laptops. And when they've actually parsed out, how did these different note takers do on exams, they find that the students who took notes by hand did far better on the exams than the students who were taking notes on laptops. And you think, well, now why should that be? Well, part of it is that when people are taking notes by hand, you're thinking and writing at the same time, and which requires automatic handwriting, certainly, and it has to be fast enough. But you're also making decisions as you go. What's more important than that? This is more important than that, so I'm going to write that down because I can't write everything down. Whereas those students who are taking notes on a laptop are kind of transcribing the lecture. In other words, they're not thinking as deeply as writing the notes as the students who are doing note-taking by hand. Now, not everybody can take notes really quickly, and there are certainly accommodations for note-takings, but life is easier if you can do some writing by hand. And that requires enough practice to be able to do that. And so what we found is and also the other thing that has come to light through research is that handwriting instruction goes hand in hand with other literacy instruction. So forming letters and making the letters and associating them with the sounds that are in the letter, in the words and so on, is tremendously helpful for that mapping that needs to occur between the sound of the letter and the letter itself. And spelling patterns and so on. So we have, we use Preventing, there are a lot of handwriting instruction programs. We use Preventing Academic Failure, the PAF, cursive handwriting program in our school. Wilson Language also has a cursive writing program. There are others. I think what's most important is that students get early on, as they're learning to write, that they get actual instruction in how to form letters in either print or cursive. Cursive actually, if it's taught correctly, can be a great time saver. And children like it, you know. And I've seen students with dysgraphia diagnoses, with messy print handwriting and so on, end up with beautiful handwriting when they're taught to do it and when they are held accountable for it. So they have to use it, and that's what's important. So, and we do, in our lower school, we absolutely hold them accountable. And you see that, you know, you see just, it makes a huge difference. So just because somebody has a diagnosis of dysgraphia doesn't mean they're not going to be able to learn to handwrite. But it does require practice, so it's automatic enough the kids can use it. So, and I mean, part of the reason that that handwriting is important is that it's basically engaging different brain systems. I mean, there's a graphomotor skill development in just using your hands and fingers. And there's, you know, just holding the pencil, forming the letters. There's a hand to brain connection that is an important, connection to make, the propriokinetic connection between the hand and the brain. And it also, as I said, it strengthens that letter sound connection. And, you know, handwriting linked to spelling is important so that the writers can translate ideas pretty easily into written language, because these things, you know, poor handwriting and poor spelling are huge barriers to being able to write. And then the other thing too is the more automatic the handwriting is, the more cognitive working space and attention are available for harder tasks, which is an important thing too. So, so I think you know, in remediating some of these students, it's important that the programs that are used be multisensory. There's a program that I use quite a lot that was developed by speech and language folks, that's sort of a speech to print approach, the Spelllinks word study and spelling curriculum, largely focusing on spelling actually, but when you teach someone to spell, you're also teaching them to read. And then the Wilson Reading System and other Orton Gillingham based programs also involve a lot of spelling instructions. So it's really important when students are learning to read that they also learn to spell, that they build the knowledge of orthographic patterns and the sound awareness of the sounds in letters and so on, and that they get handwriting instruction and that they're held accountable for it, and that they also get explicit instruction in actually writing, in grammar and sentence structure, as well and paragraph structure. And at this point, I am going to look at accommodations for this, because I want to move on to dyslexia here in a minute. But accommodations, there are a number of them. There are text readers, of course, which are helpful for actually reading and audiobooks. But for writing and spelling, voice recognition, in other words, you speak into a microphone that then writes words that you dictate, can be an incredible incredible help for students who really have difficulty with, spelling, grammar, and being able to write. And that takes some of that burden away so that students can think about, they still need to plan, they still need to organize, but that takes some of the burden off spelling recognition and spelling and grammar. Keyboarding, everybody needs to know how to, well, that's, some people are questioning, do we really need to keyboard too? There are also spell check and spell predict that are available in writing programs and so on, like Kurzweil 3000 and like Co-Writer by Don Johnston. And then there's grammar check. Grammarly is one of those that will look at your, analyze your writing and suggest different things, ways to do sentences. These are people who probably need extended time on tests. And if note-taking is a problem, class note-takers are another accommodation that are widely used, certainly in colleges and probably some in high schools as well. So before we go on there, do we have any questions? We do.
Yes,
okay.
We do have a few that have come in.
Great.
So kind of talking about accommodations, someone was asking specifically about typical accommodations for a student with dyscalculia.
Well, a student with dyscalculia, that's a great question. Very good. There aren't as many accommodations for math as there are for, language-based stuff. For math, I think one of the big all-time accommodations is for students to be able to use calculators. And I know people, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to teach elementary students their times tables and to develop some mental math so that they have more automaticity. But for as students go through and math gets harder, it really is a burden if you're slow to recall simple mathematical facts and so on, or if you and it can lead to errors if you're not absolutely accurate. So calculators are indeed important. Other things, I think for math remediation, for accommodations, of course, extended time, more time on tests is important. And they may need to have a test read to them if there are word problems, and that certainly works too. There's not as, again, the biggest thing that we do to help students for intervention is to teach them strategies of problem-solving approaches, how to, how to serve, how to plan and figure out what's most important in terms of setting up a math problem. And I would say those are the major kinds of things that we do. That and really, helping them remediating with, with lots of visual and manipulatives so that they really understand concepts very thoroughly. You're muted.
And then another question about math and dyslexia. It says, what about reversals in math equations, like a 14 becomes a 41? Is that dyslexia related?
It can be, yeah, it can be. It can also be, there's a certain amount of that's part of that visual spatial piece. And, if 14, there's a 4 in there, and it's entirely, that's again that association thing, which gets in the way. So if they're thinking 14, and so then you write a 4 down, and then you write a 1 down, you've reversed it, but it's because your association with the number is off just a little. So that's again where language gets in the way sometimes.
All right, so then, excuse me, there's a few more questions. For a student who can read a document and catch all of the grammar and spelling errors, but then cannot produce correct spelling words when writing it out, an encoding issue, could that be a behavior of dysgraphia?
Yeah, yeah. In other words, a student who can actually edit, you mean, but can't spell very well when they're actually writing. It could be, because what that tends to suggest there is that the student knows rules, and with editing, can check and see, can use spell predict and spell check and so on to check spelling, has a visual image of what the words are, which is good, mental orthographic image or something, and can put in periods and capitals and stuff. But then when you're writing, the thing is about writing is that you have to be very automatic at spelling and grammar, those kind of what we call lower order processes, so that you don't have to think about it. If you start having to think about it, then it's going to interfere with, with your plan of writing and what the content of what you're writing. So when that happens, my guess is that the person is really focusing on what he or she wants to say, and they just don't have the bandwidth to also think about spelling and grammar. But on the other hand, writing is, should be a process, and revision and proofreading are very key to writing. So, I generally find if students can write, even if they're not spelling things correctly and there are some grammar issues, if they have good output in terms of, expressing ideas, the other stuff can be dealt with. And again, sometimes that, I had a student some years ago in where I was teaching in a college, and that student had pretty significant dyslexia and dysgraphia, but he had a wonderful voice for writing. So, he would write lots of stuff, and it was really good. Now, he failed English all the way through high school because his teachers couldn't read it. So when we helped him learn you to use Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a voice recognition software. And all he would dictate, he would write stuff out, but then he would dictate it, and it would come out looking beautiful and spelled right. I mean, great big guy, wonderful person. And he wept when he saw it because he'd never been able on his own to produce anything, you know, that looked as good as that. So that was really rewarding.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And then here's a really great question. Why do some people and places, why do they not recognize dysgraphia?
Well, dysgraphia, you know, the thing is, dysgraphia as such is kind of people don't understand it because they think it's messy handwriting and that's it. When in fact it's kind of a more broad-based learning challenge that can be handwriting and spelling and interference with written output. So generally anymore, now I know dyslexia is now an allowable diagnosis in a psychologist's report, which it didn't used to be. It used to have to be a reading disorder. I think generally the dysgraphia is the attempt to cover it is like a written language disorder, and that covers spelling and writing and things of that nature. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about dysgraphia.
And then what about a new reader that's struggling to remember the sounds of letters? What would you recommend?
A new reader struggling to remember the sounds of letters. Well, I like to start with the sounds first and then connect to the letters. And I also, when I teach students, I want to have them, and I'm talking about older students too, when they're writing letters or spelling, I want them saying the sounds as they write the letter. And so that they're, instead of writing, you know, B-E-D, they're going B-E-D as they're forming the letter. And that is an important task that leads to what we call orthographic mapping, which will build a more robust internal representation of the sounds of the letters and glue them more firmly together.
There was one question about geometry specifically when we're talking about math,
Yes.
and what kind of accommodations there might be for that.
That's a great question, and you know, I honestly don't know the answer to that, but whoever is asking that question, I would be, you know, to send an email with that question, and I will ask our, you know, we have a fabulous math teacher in our upper school who teaches geometry, and she can probably tell me what kinds of accommodations she uses with students. And I'd be happy to find that out, and I'll let you know. So I promise I will. I don't know it off the top of my head, but that's a great question.
And then the last two questions are about handwriting specifically. For a student who has dysgraphia, is there a discrepancy between the handwriting using manuscript versus cursive, or will there consistently be issues with handwriting in both systems?
Well, actually, that is a really great question. Research tends to suggest, and there's been research on this, that, you know, that cursive writing, you know, there are some people who say, don't bother teaching manuscript writing, just teach cursive. Now, usually what teachers do, and this is the case in our school too, the very youngest students learn manuscript writing, but the following year they start in with cursive, and we do it really pretty gradually over the course, you know, of the year, but it makes a big difference.
Okay. And then a similar question, is there any benefit to teaching handwriting skills to a middle or high schooler student with dysgraphia?
Another really good question. you can do it, but it's hard. I mean, first of all, you know, a middle or high school student, I always remind people, you know, you know, the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, is really clear here. If the student wants to have better handwriting and is willing to practice and work toward it, yes, I would say it takes somebody who's taught handwriting to be able to do it, and an agreement on the part of the student that this is something they want to do. But yeah, like a lot of things, I mean, you can teach an older student, high school, college student to read if they want to learn. But, you know, you have to be willing. If they're just told, well, you need to improve your handwriting, so, you know, you need to do this. It's, you know, and again, that old joke about, you know, arguing with a teenager is like mud wrestling with a pig. You both get dirty and the pig likes it. So you know, I don't think it just, it takes, you know, they won't do it automatically because it's not like, unless they really, really want to do it.
Well, that's all the questions we have right now, so.
All right, well then we can just move right on to dyslexia. And before we get into dyslexia, I think it's helpful to know a little bit about how the brain learns to read. And again, the brain is plastic and changeable, and it can make new connections to accommodate inventiveness. So, you know, our brains did not evolve to read. They did evolve for us to speak. So speaking is a really naturally developmental process in humans, unless there's some other kinds of other kinds of issues in the brain that prevent that. But by and large, most people will learn to speak a language. So we have all those neurons, those neuronal circuits that we use for oral language. And what happens is that the brain actually uses those, recycles those to accommodate written language. So really, written language, when teaching kids to read and spell and so on, a lot of this follows oral language, which is why I, you know, instead of saying like the names of letters all the time, I prefer the sounds, because the sounds are what we've learned to speak with, you know. And so, and that I think is a guiding principle for instruction, you know, intervention and so on. So what does a reader have to be able to do? Well, for simple word recognition, first of all, they have to be aware of sounds, that words are made up of sounds that are glued together. So that means that, you know, that if you ask a student or a child to tell you the sounds in the word cat, they should be able to go cat. And if they can't, that indicates that they're not, that the word is just a unit to them, and they are not recognizing the individual sounds, and that requires some intervention, some work. The other thing they need to do is to be able to break the code of reading, which, in other words, to look at a word and recognize the sounds in the word and say it. Now that takes, so initially, learning to read will be slower because students are figuring out those sounds and blending them together, but it doesn't take long before they're familiar with all that and they can actually read seemingly without decoding, but everyone starts with decoding. Sight word recognition, they have to be able to really read well. You have to be able to recognize words on sight. And that doesn't mean you haven't had to go through the process of decoding, But to read fluently, you need to be able to recognize a lot of words just by looking at them. And automaticity, meaning essentially sight word recognition pretty automatically, so you can read in a pretty good stream. The other thing that students need to do, they need to have a certain level of vocabulary knowledge, so that they can understand the semantic part of what exactly they're reading. And to really understand, you get the big picture understanding of what they're reading. They need to have enough background knowledge that they can relate with reading to some of their experience. And they need to be able to make inferences, or in other words, to read between the lines, to make some conclusions about what they're reading that aren't necessarily stated specifically. So there are levels of language that go into reading. So phonology, which is the sound structure of the language, that's the letter sound correspondence, that's the knowledge that CH, although it involves two letters, makes one sound. They need to be able to recognize visually the letters, so that they and then associate that with the sounds. They need to be able to understand the meaning of the words, and also how words are combined in text. What a normal sentence is like. You know, and then finally, and this may be some of the more difficult things, is to understand that words actually, our language is complicated. It has word roots, it has prefixes, and it has suffixes. And for people with dyslexia, the suffix thing is really challenging, recognizing the base word and so on. So our language is made up of words from many other languages, and which is a blessing and a curse, because the blessing is that we have so many words that we have available to use that we've borrowed from other languages, but the curse is they all come from different languages, and they all have they may have weird spellings and weird features that other languages don't have, which makes it harder to read and write. So in a average non-dyslexic developing brain, there are basically four, but this slide kind of covers the big thing. There are three major areas of on the left side of the brain that are responsible for our ability to read. Okay, so the first one is the occipital lobe, which is actually in the back of the brain. That is what enables us. The occipital lobe enables us to see, and this is where visual letter recognition occurs. So, and then in the middle, we have, in the midbrain on the left side of the brain here, we have what's called Wernicke's area, which is where we process the meaning of sounds and words to understand what's being heard. Okay, so first you recognize the letter, and you understand that the sounds, there's meaning, and toward the front of the brain is Broca's areas, which is where the brain processes the sounds of language to create speech. So in reading, here with the occipital lobe, that's the letter recognition. And that's where, if you see the word cat, it recognizes the C and the A and the T. In Wernicke's area, it associates that with a meaning, so a cat. And finally, in Broca's area toward the front, we've got the sounds at that we can associate. So we bring all these things together just to read this one word. So, you know, meaning contributes a lot. If, you know, you find if with working with kids, if they can't associate the meaning with the word, they may be able to read it, but it's like a nonsense word to them. And familiar words are much more easily read. So that's kind of what happens. There is also a visual word form area toward the back of the brain, which enables us to read more quickly, but it's not on this slide. So then too, we have strands of reading that gradually have to be knitted together for there to be really skilled reading. And, you know, down here, where we have word recognition, this is where people with dyslexia have their greatest difficulty. This is where the ability to awareness of sounds, you know, that there are sounds in words, there are syllables in words, that words are made up of these different things. And then there is an alphabet, there is a sound symbol correspondence that has to be made between the sounds and the letters. And then also there's, as words become familiar, there's sight recognition, which enables us to read at a greater rate. So we start with those when we're teaching students to read, and gradually those things get knitted together and become increasingly automatic. Now up here with language comprehension, here, this is where, in order to really understand what you're reading, what we call the higher order processes, we need background knowledge, you know, so kids who have been read to and have been, you know, who's come from homes where people talk to each other, you know, and read and so on, that gives them some background knowledge and also some vocabulary knowledge, that they have more words. They need to have language structure, in other words, how print works, what syntax is, you know, and then they need to be able to, you know, understand, to reason, verbal reasoning. This is where reading between the lines, understanding metaphors, understanding comparisons and structures like that. And then the general literacy knowledge, like in print concepts, how paragraphs are organized, how essays are organized, you know, and different genres, that there's informational and there's also narrative writing and stuff. So all that gets kind of, you know, starts out very separately and gradually becomes increasingly strategic, and, you know, and comes together with all the word recognition stuff and gradually leads to skilled reading, where fluent execution of word recognition and text comprehension just sort of go hand in hand. Now, if there's an issue with either level of this, then that's going to make a difference in whether skilled reading is easier to achieve or harder. So, and so in dyslexia, which is a brain-based disorder and has to do largely with difficulty processing sounds in a language. If you can't really hear the sounds, then it's really difficult to associate those sounds with letters if you're not hearing them in the first place. So this is going to, it's going to affect the ability to read, write, and spell. And actually, dyslexia, as you may have seen in the graphic, it's the biggest, it's the largest kind of category of specific learning disabilities, and accounts for about 80% of all learning disabilities. But it is not the curse necessarily that that it used to be. Sally Shaywitz, who did some of the most important work from Yale University and did some of the really important research in discovering exactly how the brain reads and how we can intervene, calls it an unexpected weakness in a sea of strength. And usually that there are compensating strengths in people with dyslexia that that make them kind of very very good problem solvers, creative, things of that nature. Here you see basically the percent of the population, about 20%, 15 to 20% of people in any culture will fit what's defined as dyslexia. Now, of that 20%, 10 to 13% of them have some trouble with their, with their coding, with hearing sounds and being able to break the code. But it's pretty remediable. Then there are people who are more serious. Usually they have some additional cognitive challenges that make it even harder to address some of the reading. Not that we can't, but that's how it kind of breaks down. So, and you think, now, why does this happen? Well, it could be that there are some atypical structures or things don't function quite the way they should in, in the brain. There is a genetic piece to dyslexia, and that plays a role in early brain development. Dyslexia can run in families. And, again, the atypical brain development after birth can affect connections in the neural networks, and that can cause issues. And then, vision, hearing, perceptual development, anything like that. If you're hearing impaired, visually impaired, it's going to affect your reading and language development. And then, of course, environmental factors, which is more important than we used to think. If they're kids who grow up in homes where there's pretty low literacy there, maybe parents who don't have much of an educational background, so there's not reading and other kinds of language activities going on. And of course, if adverse cultural influences, that if kids are hungry or they're fearful or they have lots of anxiety about things, that is going to negatively affect reading development, because honestly, if you don't get some of your more basic needs met, it's going to impact your learning. So here what you see, so you can see when we do brain scans, here are the 3 areas in the brain that on the left side of the brain, that are responsible for, the neural connections make to enable us to read. Someone with dyslexia, generally when they're trying to do a reading task, you really only see on the left side of the brain one area that lights up, and these others are not working, so they're not connecting. The right side of the brain tries to make up the difference, but it's just plain not very good at it. So, but what we can do is with remediation, we can actually change the neural connections. It's amazing. So there are things that are important to know are not true. Myth, first of all, dyslexia is not related to IQ or intelligence at all. Very incredibly intelligent people have had dyslexia and do have dyslexia. And Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb and the phonograph and tons of things, basically only had a 3rd grade, was horribly dyslexic, and his 3rd grade teacher told his mother to take him out of school because he was too stupid to really gain anything from it. And of course, he goes on and becomes an incredible inventor, which happens because oftentimes there are visual, spatial, and creative and problem-solving skills in people with dyslexia that flourish. It is not uncommon. As you saw, it can be up to 20% of the population. It is not rare in females. Whoops, sorry. It is not rare in females. Probably more males get the diagnosis, but plenty of females do too. It has nothing to do with motivation. Letter reversal will occur in all kids as they're beginning to develop the graphomotor ability and visual perceptual ability to write letters. And it's just that dyslexia to some extent is a developmental disorder. So, the letter reversals generally stop as these students are, move further along in their language development and their reading development. It is not caused by visual impairments. And if you think visual tracking, if somebody tries to sell you a visual tracking or, some kind of visual oriented training, don't do it. It's not. There's some little bits of visual stuff that people find, but by and large, the road to remediation is through sounds and mapping sounds to letters and learning to decode and so on. Dyslexia is a brain-based disorder, and therefore it is always with someone who has it. However, it can be managed really well. It can be remediated and accommodated so that people with dyslexia can fulfill their potential through education and other types of personal development. Oftentimes, you'll see that there is a strength model of dyslexia. Many people with dyslexia have a tremendously good mechanical aptitude. They can think in 3 dimensions. They tend to have creative approaches to problem solving. They can visualize things. There are plenty of artists, great artists, who are dyslexic and somehow their brains, the right side of the brain flourishes, which is where visualization and artistic expression live. They oftentimes can have, they oftentimes have different patterns of brain function. They can spot connections and a relationship between objects, concepts, viewpoints. They can be very good problem solvers and rather creative. And, they can sometimes connect diverse perspectives and see big picture, the big picture concepts and things like that. This is a little bit of a controversial area of research, I will say, but my own personal experience in working with students with dyslexia of all ages is I sure have seen this pattern in the students I've taught. So dyslexia, again, the core deficit is sounds. The letter sound correspondence is slow and effortful, but it can improve. Spelling tends to be more difficult than reading. So there's a lot of times vowel sound confusion between eh, ah, and so on. And, letter reversals, these are similar, these appear similarly, and so you'll see this kind of reversal. It does get better with remediation. There are some cognitive factors that make learning to read and spell a little more challenging. One of them is, very slow information processing and slow retrieval of information. That just slows everything down, and the more it slows down, the harder it is to keep your focus on kind of what the bigger picture is. And poor working memory, like with all areas, can be, can affect that ability to develop automatic sight recognition of words. And language processing is, for people who have trouble expressing themselves or their receptive language, that can impede vocabulary development and can have an effect on comprehension for sure. And there's our working memory too. So what you can do to help, what can parents do? First of all, getting a psychoeducational evaluation is very important to getting a proper diagnosis. Without a proper diagnosis, you're kind of fumbling around in the dark trying to remediate it. What that consists of is an IQ test, or basically a test of cognitive function, and also some achievement tests. So we look at, what's the cognitive function like, and is achievement falling below that? And that's an indication that there are other factors that are impeding achievement. There can be other additional tests on particularly how well somebody processes sounds, how they process information, and so on. And this gives a diagnosis and recommendations for treatment. And then the diagnostic recommendations may be for tutoring, may be for treatment programs. And then, and then comes the issue of communicating and partnering with the school, possibly through an IEP or a 504, perhaps working with a learning specialist at a school, depending, and so on. Those are the steps toward getting the appropriate intervention and remediation for dyslexia and accommodation. So again, I can't stress how important it is that all students be taught with scientifically based reading instruction, which is direct, it's explicit, it's sequential, it's multisensory. In other words, they see it, they say it, they touch it, they write it. And ideally, that reading instruction should be diagnostic, especially with a student with dyslexia, because you have to really look at the child in front of you, and the student needs to, you need to make sure that the student masters each step along the way. Otherwise, remediation is not going to work as well. And instruction should include these 5 big areas: sounds, letter sound correspondence, reading rate and accuracy, vocabulary, and comprehension. Here are some of the research validated word study and spelling programs. Some are based on the Orton-Gillingham theory. Others are based on some very good research, Spelllinks and Lindemood Bell. We teach the Wilson Reading System here at Groves. We also use Spelllinks word study and spelling for our, for some students who really need some very specialized approaches. And it is 8:30, and I want to be sure that we have time for any questions that come up.
Yeah, we do have a few in here.
Great.
One is actually from a Groves parent talking about dyslexia diagnosis. I was told by Groves that my son has almost outgrown his dyslexia diagnosis, almost didn't qualify for that diagnosis anymore as he has improved so much. But isn't it something you can't outgrow? Kind of confusing.
It is confusing. That's a great question. So basically, what his diagnosis says is that in terms of achievement, his achievement is high enough that it doesn't fall in that category. You know, we're not seeing severe effects of the dyslexia. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have it. It's still, you know, his brain is structured in a way that his brain structure and function is such that it falls into a dyslexic category. And if you did a brain scan, you'd probably see it. However, he may have been remediated. He may have been, you know, tutored or whatever, so that his achievement in reading is higher than you might imagine for a dyslexia diagnosis. Again, doesn't mean he is, and that just means his reading ability skills have grown, so that he's, you know, he's better than he used to be. But it doesn't mean he doesn't still have dyslexia. There are, you know, there are things that go along with dyslexia, like a slower reading rate and some things like that, that people really don't outgrow.
Okay. Is letter reversal actually attached more to dysgraphia rather than dyslexia?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think letter reversal reflects kind of a developmental level of visual perception and motoric ability. So there's also a certain amount of, and this has to do with memory retrieval, you know, with if you're confusing the sounds, like for example, b and d sound a lot alike to someone who doesn't process sounds very well. So then if you're told that b goes with a b and d goes with a d, then suddenly you're thinking, okay, b, d, you know, what is that? And then oftentimes, you know, there goes a d instead of a b. Generally, students can be remediated out of that. Although when kids get really tired, their brains are tired, they sometimes, I notice, revert back. But it's something that really is kind of reflective of confusion of sounds and symbols and things like that, that does get sorted out with remediation.
And we have two questions around actually diagnosing dyslexia related to age. How young can you recognize this, and how young would you suggest starting intervention, especially if it runs in families and a sibling has it? One example from the similar question is, my son was diagnosed with ADHD in 2nd grade, but it wasn't until he was about 20 that the dyslexia was diagnosed.
Yeah, I've seen that happen before. ADHD can sort of mask. People like to say, oh, well, he has ADHD, so that's the problem. When in fact, if they did a careful phonological processing assessment, you'd probably see it earlier. You know, I would say, there are some signs that that you can see in preschool kids having to do with their sound processing. Basically, if students are having a really hard time learning to read in 1st grade, you know, then you may want to, it may be worth doing some assessment. Generally, the earlier you start remediation, the less time it takes, and the more effective it is, only because it takes less time, and you can keep that student kind of on track to be able to hopefully read at grade level by the time they reach 3rd or 4th grade. So there is some, you know, doing a cognitive assessment or a psychoeducational assessment too young, and you may not get accurate results. But you certainly can do some do some assessment, and particularly in the area of phonological sound processing and so on. And but it's never too late. I mean, I've taught students who are in their 20s to read, but they wanted that too.
Let's see, one question that came in a little while ago. Is there any connection between dyslexia and being right or left-handed?
No.
Okay. And
That
then,
used to be a theory, but it's not,
oh,
there's
really?
nothing to it. Yeah. Right.
Okay. And then question talking about vision therapy. So someone commented that it sounded like that you wouldn't promote going to vision therapy to help with dyslexia.
Correct.
Clarifying, okay. And then how would you best help a student who, when you tell them a letter or number, can show you where it is, but struggles to tell you what the letter or number is when asked what it is?
So in other words, okay, let me see if I understand that. Say that again.
Sure.
What?
So when you tell them a letter or number, and they can show you where it is, like on a piece of paper, but
Yeah.
they struggle to tell you what the letter or number is when they're asked, what is this?
So in other words, if you point it to it, they can't tell. Yeah. Interesting. Well, it depends on the age of the child, you know, but that speaks to the need to go, the need to really work on sound and symbol mapping, basically. You know, if you know if you can say the letter or the number and they can show you, but then the reverse isn't true, then you know, then that just speaks to the importance of multisensory work, you know, forming the letter, naming the letter, knowing the sound of the letter. So, you know, when we remediate students, one of the things we do, we go through what's called a quick drill, where we go through the letters and teach them to say the letter and the sound. But then we reverse that and we teach them also, when we say the sound, to name the letter. So, and they do, you know, so that just reflects, I think, needing more practice at, you know, letter recognition and so on.
Okay. And then another clarification question. So a person could have dysgraphia without dyslexia. My son is an excellent reader, but listening tonight, he has so many dysgraphic traits.
Yeah, that happens. That can happen.
Okay.
And then you have to decide, you know, what do you want to do about it? Depending on the age of the student. Spelling, you can work on spelling specifically, and grammar and so on, very direct instruction. There's also a lot of accommodations for some of the dysgraphic traits, like voice recognition, for example, and Grammarly and things like that. So it kind of depends on his age and stage and willingness to work on it.
Okay. And then kind of a general question about just where do you start, you know, when you think that your child has ADHD or dyslexia, how do you begin?
Well, are you talking, I mean, I don't know whether you're talking about getting the public school to do some assessment. Under the under the special education IDEA, if you request in writing to the school district that you are concerned that your child may have dyslexia, or, you know, particularly dyslexia, ADHD isn't covered under IDEA, but then they have, I don't know, 60 days or something like that to respond, and then they have to do some sort of, evaluation. Now, you know, it may be, some districts, it really varies by district how well they do. You can also start with you know, with a psychoeducational assessment too, privately, but that costs money. So you can, you know, that basically starting there would be what I would suggest doing.
Okay. And then what advice do you have for students who are not able to hear or distinguish between the letter sounds? So for example, a W and an R, F, or TH sound. Is this something that can be taught, or is it a matter of hearing maturity?
Depends on the age of the student. It could be an articulation issue that speech and language might deal with. Oftentimes what we do with students, because F and TH sound very much alike. And if you're trying to teach reading over Zoom, which I've been doing this week, you know, the microphone makes it just that much blurrier. So what I do, it's important, mouth position makes a difference. So you tell students, watch my mouth, and you can also teach them mouth, how the mouth creates sounds, so that they can feel what it's like to do a TH or an F, and how they're different. In fact, Linda Mood Bell has a program called Lips, which does that very thing, and is an excellent program for that kind of difficulty.
Okay. Let's see. So what about a child you have worked with for over a year on recognizing sounds and matching with letters, and sometimes she knows them and other times she doesn't? She will also say the correct sounds when sounding out a word, but then guess a completely different word.
Yeah, well, I don't know, you know, again, that's kind of vague. I don't know what kind of instruction she's had. In general, it's in general, you have to have very consistent, regular practice, and you have to really instruct directly, you know, and have them practice a, apple, and I have, you know, rubber bands that I pull out. Okay, we're going to say and really draw it out so that they feel it and hear it. And then, you know, and then looking at a word and they guess, and I just say, you're guessing. You need to, you know, you need to use your sounded out strategy, and things like that. So there's things you can do, like tapping sounds in words and things that, but it's also important that, you know, that the instruction be very cumulative. So you start with pretty simple words for students to read, and when they're really automatic with those, then you move on to the next level. So it's hard to answer that without more information, but you know.
Yeah. And then going back to the question about starting the conversation with your child's school, who would you recommend reaching out to? Would it just be the regular teacher? Would it be some kind of student counselor, or?
It depends on the school. You know, if it's a public school teachers may not be able to recommend, they may not be able to recommend evaluation. It kind of depends. Some of them can't, and some of them don't know. You know, there isn't future education around dyslexia, and what to do about it is very catch as catch can. And you know, in Minnesota, we now have a reading statute so that teachers have to take a reading course, but it's only one course, and a lot of them haven't had it. So again, I would, again, to go through the formal procedure of requesting an evaluation, and you can call the school and ask where that should go. It probably goes to somebody in the special education part of the school, but not to your individual teacher. It's an administrative process.
Gotcha. And then just a general question about best practice accommodations and classroom supports for dyslexia.
Again, it sort of depends on the age of the student and so on. It's important not to ask a student with dyslexia to read out loud if they don't want to do it. Round robin reading, I've heard so many stories about kids who would, who basically would try to figure out what their reading would be, and then they realize they couldn't do it, so then they create a spitball, throw it across the room so they get tossed out and spend the rest of the day in school suspension because they didn't want to read, and that's horrible. They can have accommodations would be having, being able to have books on tape, being able to have, or a text reader to read books that they need that are at their grade level. Maybe their reading skills aren't quite to that level. And a general understanding, it's going to take them more time to do things, and they may need things read to them. And and if nothing else, you can get a 504 plan that specifies some of these things as well.
Well, that was all of the questions.
Okay. Well, this has been lovely, and I really appreciate, being here, and for everybody who was here, I've enjoyed, hopefully you've gained some information about these 3 learning challenges. And if you have other questions and you want to email Joanna and she can forward them to me, I'm certainly happy to respond.
Sounds good. I will put my email in the chat right now.
Okay.
And then also you will be getting everyone a follow-up email tomorrow that will have a link to Ellen's slides and a link to where the video will be posted. So if you have any other questions, just email me back. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.